Picture the most powerful man in Europe, lying in agony as his own flesh rots away from his bones. The smell so putrid that even hardened servants flee from his presence. Dogs refuse to enter his chamber. This is the untold story of how England's Golden Prince became a walking corpse, and why his government buried the truth for over 4 centuries. What I'm about to reveal comes from secret medical records that historians desperately tried to hide, documents that paint such a horrifying picture of royal decay that they were locked away in private collections, gathering dust for generations. But modern forensic analysis has finally uncovered the shocking medical truth behind one of history's most mysterious deaths. The man who tore apart the Catholic Church, who sent 2 wives to their deaths, who transformed from Renaissance prince to tyrannical monster, met an end so grotesque that even his enemies would have felt pity. This isn't the sanitized version you learned in school. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of what happens when absolute power meets absolute physical destruction. Before we dive deeper into this medical nightmare, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps me uncover more hidden histories that mainstream sources won't touch. And trust me, what's coming next will completely change how you view the Tudor dynasty forever. Let me take you back to a winter day that changed everything. January 24th, 1536, Greenwich Palace. The tournament grounds buzzed with excitement as England's monarch prepared for what seemed like just another day of royal sport. At 44, Henry still cut an impressive figure, standing over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of athletic build that came from years of hunting, dancing, and yes, jousting. This was still the Renaissance prince, who could speak 4 languages fluently, compose music that moved courtiers to tears, and debate theology with Europe's finest scholars. The crowd held its breath as their king, resplendent in custom-forged armor worth more than most nobles' entire estates, thundered down the tilt yard. His opponent waited at the far end, equally armored, equally determined. The very ground trembled under the weight of these war horses, bred specifically for battle, trained to charge without hesitation into the chaos of combat. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. In the space of a heartbeat, everything went catastrophically wrong. The horses collided with a force that modern witnesses might compare to a head-on car crash. The impact sent both riders flying, but Henry's massive frame, encased in 300 pounds of man and metal, struck the frozen ground with devastating force. Then came the moment that would haunt England for the next 11 years. His own warhorse, a magnificent beast weighing over 1,000 pounds, stumbled and fell directly onto the king's prone body. Silence. Complete, terrifying silence swept across the tournament grounds. Courtiers froze in their seats, too shocked to even breathe. Was their king dead? Had England just lost its monarch to a sporting accident? For 2 agonizing hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious while his kingdom held its breath. 2 hours where England effectively had no ruler. 2 hours that his pregnant wife, Anne Boleyn, spent pacing her chambers, praying for news of her husband's survival, knowing that her own fate hung in the balance. When Henry finally opened his eyes, witnesses noticed something immediately disturbing. The sharp intelligence that had once sparkled there seemed different, clouded somehow. His first words weren't relief at surviving or concern for his subjects' terror. Instead, he exploded into a rage so violent that seasoned courtiers stepped back in alarm, demanding to know why the tournament had been stopped, why everyone looked so frightened. Something fundamental had shifted in that moment of impact. Modern neuroscientists, studying the detailed accounts left by court physicians, now believe Henry suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, specifically to his frontal lobe. This region controls personality, impulse regulation, and emotional stability. The evidence supporting this theory is compelling and chilling. Before that January day, Henry had shown remarkable restraint for a monarch of his era. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking an annulment, a decision he agonized over publicly. His execution rate was actually lower than most of his royal predecessors. He was known for his quick wit, his charm, his ability to inspire loyalty among his subjects. After the accident, a different man emerged from that broken body. The executions began in earnest. Anne Boleyn, the woman he'd moved heaven and earth to marry, lost her head just 4 months later. Thomas Cromwell, his most trusted advisor and architect of the English Reformation, would follow her to the scaffold. The charming Renaissance prince who had once danced until dawn at court festivities now flew into rages over the smallest perceived slights. Servants began reporting disturbing behavior. They'd find the king weeping uncontrollably one moment, then screaming for someone's head the next. His mood swings became legendary throughout Europe, with foreign ambassadors reporting back to their courts about the English king's increasingly erratic behavior. But the brain injury was only the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare. That same catastrophic fall had reopened an old wound on his leg, a relatively minor injury from an earlier jousting accident that had healed years before. In an age without antibiotics, without any real understanding of infection control, this reopened wound became a death sentence that would take 11 years to carry out. Imagine living with open sores the size of dinner plates on both legs, weeping pus constantly, never fully healing, causing pain so intense that even the softest touch of silk bedsheets would make you scream in agony. This wasn't mere discomfort. This was a living hell that Henry would endure until his dying day. Dr. Thomas Vickery's secret medical notes, hidden away in the Royal College of Physicians and only discovered in the 1960s, describe these wounds as ulcers of a most grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond all measure. The king's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice daily, filling bronze bowls with infected discharge that servants would quickly and discreetly remove from the royal presence. Henry, in his vanity and desperation, tried everything to hide this horrifying deterioration. He designed special garters weighted with lead, believing that pressure would force the wounds closed. Instead, this cut off circulation and made the infection exponentially worse. He doused himself in the most expensive perfumes available, mixing rose oil with ambergris imported from the far corners of his empire, but nothing could mask the overwhelming stench of decay. Even more telling, he instructed his portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous, powerful stance we still recognize today. Every image was a lie, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of strength while his body betrayed him more each day. The infection wasn't content to stay localized. Every single day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his bloodstream, traveling to his brain, his liver, his heart. Modern medical analysis suggests Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that releases a constant stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout the body. These toxins created a cascade of symptoms that transformed Henry's daily existence into a waking nightmare. The constant pain would have been excruciating, like the worst toothache imaginable, but in his legs, never stopping, never giving him a moment's peace. Fever would come and go in waves, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with chills the next. But perhaps most devastating were the neurological effects. The toxins crossing into his brain tissue triggered violent mood swings that had nothing to do with his actual emotions or circumstances. One moment, he might be laughing at a courtier's jest. The next, he'd be ordering that same person's execution. Paranoid delusions became commonplace. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery, that foreign assassins lurked in every shadow. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already hunting for number 4.
The teenage Catherine Howard caught his eye, a girl of perhaps 17 to his 50 years. The contrast must have been grotesque. Here was a king so morbidly obese that he needed mechanical assistance to mount his horse, pursuing a young woman who, according to court gossip, found his advances so repulsive she needed wine just to endure his presence. The year 1542 marked a terrible escalation in Henry's condition. The ulcers, which had been manageable if disgusting for 6 years, suddenly worsened dramatically. Dr. Vickery's suppressed notes describe a horrifying change in the color and consistency of the discharge. Where once it had been the typical yellow-white pus of normal infection, now it turned green, then a putrid brown that witnesses described as resembling liquid decay. Henry's weight exploded during this period. Unable to exercise due to the agonizing pain in his legs and eating constantly to distract himself from his misery, he ballooned from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. His armor from 1540, preserved in the Tower of London, shows a 48-inch waist. By 1545, new armor had to be commissioned with a staggering 54-inch waist measurement. To put that in perspective, that's wider than most modern refrigerators. The palace itself required modification to accommodate the king's monstrous bulk. Doorways were widened, and you can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court Palace today. Floors were reinforced with additional beams after Henry's weight caused dangerous sagging in several rooms. Special chairs were constructed with removable arms because the king could no longer fit between them. But it wasn't just furniture that needed modification. Henry's entire daily routine became an elaborate performance designed to hide his rapid deterioration from public view. He would be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 strong servants to manage his massive, diseased limbs. A system of pulleys and slings was secretly installed to help lift him upright, though this was carefully concealed from anyone outside his most trusted inner circle. The physical transformation was matched by an equally disturbing mental deterioration. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior that went far beyond mere bad temper, spiraling into what we would now recognize as psychosis. Henry would hold entire conversations with people who simply weren't there. He was observed arguing fiercely with his long-dead father, Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He would call out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old.
Most disturbing were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during crucial state business, his face draining of color as he stared fixedly at empty air. He would whisper phrases like, "No, not now," or "Leave me be," before exploding in rage at his utterly confused counselors. One particularly detailed account from the French ambassador describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair during a state dinner, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. The court sat frozen in terror as Henry continued his tirade against what he clearly believed was his executed wife's ghost, shouting, "I took your head once, I'll take it again," before collapsing back into his chair and resuming his meal as if nothing had happened. The king's paranoia reached extraordinary, terrifying heights. He became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for personal inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters not just for his meals but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin first to test for poison. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped up in his throne, unable to stand without significant assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, his features distorted by grotesque fluid retention. His eyes, which once a bright blue that poets had compared to summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunken deep in pouches of discolored flesh.
The smell emanating from the royal person had become impossible to disguise despite pounds of perfume, the regular burning of incense, and fresh herbs scattered constantly on the floors. Courtiers would discreetly hold pomander balls stuffed with cloves and other spices to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves and vomit after mandatory appearances before their king. The final portrait, the famous Whitehall portrait that became the template for how we imagine him today, contains a devastating secret that was only discovered when the painting was X-rayed in 1960 during restoration work. Conservators discovered that the king's left hand, which appears to be gripping a simple ceremonial cane, was originally painted holding something else entirely, a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre walking stick wasn't just a Gothic fashion statement. Henry had become so utterly obsessed with death that he carried this reminder everywhere, tapping the skull against the floor during conversations, a nervous tic that unnerved even his most loyal courtiers. The skull itself was rumored to be that of a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries, though some whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. The portrait artist, Hans Holbein, had painted this disturbing detail accurately, but after Henry's death, his young son, Edward VI, ordered it painted over. The boy king couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered as the death-obsessed madman he had truly become. Court records from those final months of 1546 paint a picture of a royal household living in sheer terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that courtiers developed an elaborate warning system with pages discreetly signaling the king's disposition using colored ribbons: red for rage, black for the deepest depression, white for the increasingly rare moments of relative calm. The king would fly into murderous rages over the smallest provocations. A servant who merely sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation as a possible assassin using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court forever, her family's lands confiscated as punishment. Most terrifying of all, Henry began ordering executions of people who were already dead, having completely forgotten that he'd killed them years earlier. It was a macabre display of his deteriorating mind, a sign that his grip on reality was slipping away entirely. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that mid-meal, Henry suddenly stood up with great difficulty and visible agony, then began shouting at an empty chair. "You dare show your face at my table," he screamed, pointing at nothing while the entire court sat frozen in horror. Henry continued his tirade against what he clearly believed was Anne Boleyn's ghost before collapsing back into his chair and resuming his meal as if nothing had happened. January 1547 brought Henry VIII to his final, agonizing decline. The ulcers on his legs had grown beyond anything the court physicians had ever encountered. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible through the rotting flesh. The tissue around the ulcers had turned black, undeniable evidence of gangrene setting in. The smell had become utterly unbearable. Servants would faint while changing the king's bedsheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather because the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin turned a sickly yellow from liver failure, his eyes matching that jaundiced hue, giving him an inhuman appearance. His tongue swelled so badly he could barely speak, his words coming out as wet, gurgling sounds that required his closest servants to interpret. His breath smelled of rotting meat, a horrifying sign that the infection had spread to his digestive system. The king's massive weight made caring for him nearly impossible. It took 6 strong men just to turn him in bed to prevent bed sores, though by this point,
Sores had developed anyway, adding to the grotesque catalogue of rotting flesh. On January 20th, Henry VIII experienced what physicians now recognize as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began to shut down. His urine, when he could produce any, was dark brown and reeked of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his already massive girth and causing agonizing pressure on his remaining functioning organs. During these final days, Henry's mental state alternated between terrifying clarity and complete delirium. In his lucid moments, he knew with absolute certainty that he was dying. He would beg his physicians to save him, promising them wealth beyond imagining if they could cure him. When they failed to provide relief, he would rage at them with what little strength remained, threatening torture and execution, though he lacked the physical ability to sign the death warrants. In his delirious periods, Henry revealed the true depths of his terror and guilt. He would cry out for his mother, dead for nearly 30 years, begging her to protect him from demons he saw crawling up from beneath his bed. He would have heartbreaking conversations with his brother Arthur, who had died in 1502, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pathetically, he would call out for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, asking her forgiveness, though she had died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier.
On January 27th, Henry suffered what modern physicians would recognize as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely, drool pooling on his pillow as he lost control of his facial muscles. His speech, already difficult due to his swollen tongue, became completely incomprehensible. England's mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion with his words, couldn't even ask for water. Yet even in this paralyzed state, Henry tried to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one functioning hand, he attempted to sign a death warrant for the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him faithfully for decades but had fallen from favor. The signature was an illegible scrawl, more inkblot than name, but Henry's servants, terrified even of their dying king, prepared to carry out the execution. Only Henry's death the very next day saved Norfolk from the scaffold. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, discovered in the library of Lambeth Palace in 1983, provides the only eyewitness account of Henry's final hours. Summoned to provide last rites, Cranmer arrived at the palace near midnight on January 27th to find Henry experiencing seizures so violent that 6 men had to hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself further. His massive body convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked and groaned. Between seizures, he would vomit black bile, a terrifying sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was beyond any description Cranmer could manage in his private writings. During brief moments of stillness, Henry's eyes would focus on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his desperate quest for heirs, begging them to forgive him and promising to be a better father if they would just come back. Then his voice would change, becoming high and terrified as he screamed about flames and demanded that someone put out the fire that only he could see. As the clock approached 2 in the morning on January 28th, Henry's breathing changed to what medical professionals call the death rattle, a wet, gurgling sound as his lungs filled with fluid. Following Protestant doctrine, Cranmer asked the dying king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. Taking Henry's massive, swollen hand in his own, the archbishop asked him to squeeze if he died in the faith of Jesus Christ. He squeezed once, weakly. Then his grip went slack forever. At 2:47 a.m. on January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII of England was dead. But the horror was far from over. Henry's corpse began decomposing with shocking speed.
The infection that had ravaged his body for years didn't stop with death. It accelerated. Within hours, his already bloated body swelled even larger as bacteria produced gases inside the corpse. The Privy Council made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death secret for 3 days, desperately needing time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating remains. The body was simply too large and too decomposed to display publicly without causing an unimaginable scandal. When embalmers attempted to preserve the body, they discovered the true extent of the internal decay. The liver was so enlarged and diseased it fell apart when touched. The heart, swollen to nearly twice normal size, was surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. One embalmer's assistant fainted when the stomach was opened, releasing such a concentrated stench that the entire team fled the room. Even packed with over 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs, wrapped in waxcloth soaked in turpentine and sealed in a massive lead coffin, Henry's decay could not be contained. During the lying-in state, witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the coffin, pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside. The final indignity came during the procession to Windsor Castle. On the second night, stopped at Sion Abbey, the pressure from gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally became too much. The lead coffin split open with a sound like thunder, putrid fluids leaking out and pooling on the chapel floor. In the morning, workers discovered that dogs had entered the chapel during the night and were found licking at the fluids that had leaked from their former king's coffin. The man who had styled himself as God's anointed representative on earth ended up as sustenance for scavenging animals. This grotesque scene was so damaging to royal prestige that all witnesses were sworn to absolute silence on pain of death. The truth was hidden so effectively that it only emerged centuries later through private diaries and foreign diplomatic reports. Henry VIII, the king who had terrorized a nation, who had broken with Rome itself to assert his divine right to rule, died rotting from the inside out, screaming in terror, his corpse so putrid it exploded in its coffin. The golden Renaissance prince, who had once been called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, ended his life as a 400-pound mass of infection and decay, his final remains providing nourishment for common dogs. This is the hidden truth that historians buried for centuries, the real story of how absolute power corrupted absolutely, not just politically, but physically, medically, and spiritually. Henry VIII's death wasn't just the end of a tyrant, it was a grotesque morality tale about the price of unchecked ambition and the inevitable triumph of mortality over even the mightiest of earthly powers.